in understanding how other countries design their constitutions so that we can learn from that constitutional design and potentially improve and enhance our own constitutional system, which has its own issues and challenges at the moment. We're going to learn about the Mexican situation here tonight, and hopefully draw some lessons and conclusions that can help the United States. Now, again, we're not doing this purely for my sort of solipsistic reasons associated with the U.S. We're certainly here to learn a lot, but it is part of a larger project to learn from other countries' constitutions. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to three wonderful friends of mine who I'm so pleased are here. Julio Rios Figueroa is a professor at the Department of Law at ETAM in Mexico City. My Spanish is terrible, so I won't try to enunciate that, although I did today at lunch, I think I did okay. But the longer name, but as you all know, it's a distinguished university in Mexico City. He is currently this year spending the year in Washington, D.C. at the Wilson Center, where he is a fellow, and he studies comparative judicial politics, the rule of law, and empirical legal studies. He has a PhD in political science from NYU. And so we're just absolutely thrilled to have him here. His recent essay is now published on our Substack, a Substack called Constitutional Conversations. It does reflect upon some of the issues that we're going to talk about tonight. So Julio, so thrilled that you're here. You have been very instrumental in my knowledge and understanding about Mexico to the extent that I have any. So thank you so much. To my left is Andreas Pozos-Loya, who is also a professor of law and political science. She's a distinguished research fellow in constitutional studies at the University of Texas. I didn't quite realize that, I don't think, where I used to be a faculty member. And she is a full-time professor at UNAM in Mexico City as well. She has done a number of very interesting things which are in the bio. Her scholarship is fascinating about constitutional change in Mexico and what drives constitutional change. And we're thrilled to be able to hear from her today, and we welcome her to ASU as well. And then on my right, she has a PhD from NYU too. Yes. And to my right is Manuel Gonzalez Oropeza, who was formerly a judge on the Federal Electoral Tribunal in Mexico and is a long-time friend of mine. The reason why I have any affiliation at all with the Mexican Electoral Tribunal, the Federal Electoral Tribunal, that manages and governs all litigation associated with electoral law in Mexico. He's formerly a judge on that court. He now is a professor of constitutional law at UNAM as well. He is the author of many books, and whenever I go to Mexico City to visit him and his incredible wife, Ana Luisa, who's with us here this evening as well, an architect, an archaeologist, not an architect, he shares with me yet another book that he has written and published about Mexican constitutional law, among many other things. So absolutely thrilled to welcome him. And there are longer bios for you to read about these incredible individuals on each table, I believe. Right, Carol? Is it all available for you? So rather than waste any more time, let me just quickly explain what we're going to do. We're going to have each of our panelists present some comments and reflection upon the Mexican Constitution and the current Mexican political situation, as well as on issues related to election law in Mexico. And I think it's about 10 minutes each or 15 minutes each. Was it 15 or?
It varies.
15 to 20 minutes each. And then we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. I know there will be questions from you. So I think we have, in the same order as we're going to proceed in the same order that is presented on the agenda that I have. You don't have, but it's the agenda that I have. So we're going to start with Julio.
No, I think it's better Andrea than myself.
Oh, thank you for telling me. Okay, so we're going to start with Andrea. As Julio said, we're going to Julio.
Present everything.
All right, I don't need to do anything.
They conspire.
I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to turn the podium over to Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you. So everyone can listen? Yeah? Great.
Very well.
Wonderful.
Would it be helpful
Yes.
for her to use this?
I think it would.
Okay.
Or is there some way that
This is good.
that's for the recording? Okay.
Okay.
Is this difficult for you? Was this
No,
troubling
no,
to
no.
use
No,
or
I
troublesome?
don't. I can use it.
We don't have a stand for it, do we? Okay.
No, I can use it.
Okay, great.
So, So it's a pleasure to be with you today. I want to thank Stephanie for the invitation. Thank you very much, as well as everyone in the Center for Constitutional Design, particularly to Carol McNamara. Thank you very much. And it's also great to share the table with Julio Rios and Manuel González Oropesa. And of course, thank you to every one of you to be here. So my task is to give you a very brief introduction to constitutional change in Mexico. I will argue in the few minutes I have that understanding constitutional change in Mexico is important not only because it has shaped a country with a population of 130 million, that is among the 15 largest economies in the world, and that shares with the US many challenges that require bilateral collaboration. But also, I think that it is important to understand the Mexican case for legal scholars in general who want to understand constitutional change more broadly and from a theoretical and comparative perspective. So Mexico exhibited for 30 years hyper-reformism. There is a pattern of constitutional change characterized by an extremely high rate of constitutional amendment. It is noteworthy that hyper-reformism is in a sense the reversal of the pattern that characterizes the US, which is one of the lowest rates of amendment in the world and in history. We could even talk about American hyper-reformism. As we will see, Mexico is not only an outlier, but also constitutes a deviant case, that is, a case that offers important theoretical insights by calling into question widely shared views with that in the literature, in particular in the literature of constitutional change in this case. The views that are called into question by Mexico's case are two, the ones that I will underline today. First is the view that if we, under a de jure rigid constitution, political fragmentation decreases the likelihood of constitutional change through amendment. In Mexico, as we will see, political fragmentation increased the rate of constitutional amendment to a very impressive degree. Second, the case of Mexico calls into question the thesis according to which amendment and interpretation have a substitutive relation. That is, that so the idea is that if we are in a country with a very high rate of amendment, the court has very little space to do interpretation. While if we have a very low rate of amendment, as in the US, the court is the one in charge of making most of the adaptation of constitutional, the constitutional adaptation is mainly through the judiciary. So this is not the case in Mexico. In Mexico, as I will show you, hyper-reformism has been accompanied by an important increment of constitutional interpretation by the Supreme Court. Moreover, arguably, the intensity of the amendment dynamics has led the Supreme Court to generate innovative constitutional criteria. I will close with a very brief account of why this pattern has probably ended with the election of President López Obrador and where the country is right now. Julio and Manuel will tell you much more about the constitutional developments of the last 4 years. I just want to note that the data I will share with you today is a result of a research project with my colleagues Camilo Saavedra and Francisca Pou. No, sorry. Yeah. So continuous and extensive change via amendment has been the main feature of Mexico's constitutionalism. From a quantitative stance, numbers look impressive. From its enactment in February 1917 to May 2020, there have been 729 amendments contained in 242 decrees of constitutional reform. Prima facie, one could think that this could only happen in a case under a very flexible constitution. But this is not Mexico's case. The amendment formula requires the positive vote of 2/3 of the attending members of each federal chamber and the ratification by half of the 32 states' legislatures, including Mexico City. As this graph shows, as political pluralism progressively grew, the number of amendments also increased sharply. So if you can see over there, starting in the 90s is where you start seeing more and more pluralism. So that will be around here, and you can see the number of amendments go up. Mm-hmm. So Mexico, as you probably know, was ruled by a hegemonic party for 7 decades. But in 1988, the PRI lost the capacity to unilaterally amend the constitution since it no longer had the 2/3 supermajority in the Chamber of Deputies. Political fragmentation grew, as did the rate of amendments, and in 2000, the PRI lost the executive for the first time. Mexico had a divided government from then on for 18 years. So we had a very, very plural political setting. As you can see, the number of amendments grew hand in hand with political fragmentation under a very rigid under a very rigid constitution. This constitutes the first anomaly. Here. To capture the nature of Mexico's hyper-reformism, it is helpful to put it in comparative perspective. As this figure shows, the Mexican Constitution is the third more amended charter in modern constitutionalism, only after the 1874 Swiss Constitution, which was replaced in 1999, and the flexible Constitution of 1852 of New Zealand. A similar conclusion emerges if we analyze endurance, as Mexico is far above the mean according to the Comparative Constitutions Project. Few constitutions have been more enduring than the 1917 Constitution one, and no other codified constitution has been subject to such a constant pattern of renewal. So over there is Mexico, if you can see it. Here is the US. Mm-hmm. Okay, the second anomaly that Mexico's pattern of constitutional change raises is a relation between hyper-reformism and interpretation as means of constitutional revision. In Mexico, constitutional hyper-reformism has been accompanied by an increased amount of constitutional interpretation by the Supreme Court. In this figure, you can see that as reformism became more intense in 1997 with the arrival of government, also did the interpretation. So if you can see the dotted, these are the amendments, mm-hmm. And these are binding precedents, and these are non-binding precedents. You can see how every line goes up. So as reform goes up, amendment, precedent, and the court's activity goes up. Okay, so along the same vein, I have argued that hyperreformism was socially and politically important in attaining the incremental and largely peaceful Mexican transition to democracy after 7 decades of hegemonic party. Without understanding the very important role that the Constitution and reforms played for democratization, one cannot understand how this very high amendment rate was even possible in the context of fragmentation. So this is one of the key lessons we are given by this case, that the relation between judicial interpretation and constitutional amendments as two modalities of change is context dependent. So we cannot assume that what happens in the US happens in every country. It is not the case that if you have a very large amendment rate, you will have, the court will not have a role. Or vice versa, that if you don't have amendments, the court will have a huge role. So I think it's, for theoretically speaking, it's very important to understand the role that changes, that constitutional amendment plays, and to see how amendment and interpretation are related. The second, 10 minutes.
Are we done?
I did, no, she's got 5.
Oh, it's 5 minutes.
Yeah. And so unfortunately, as I was telling you, the hyperreformism was also very, hyperreformism was, it also created, I think, and well, I have also argued in other research projects, that it created an obstacle for constitutional and democratic consolidation. Hyperreformism created serious constitutional dysfunctionalities. The constant change, obscurity, disorganization, and internal inconsistencies that accompanied hyperreformism made it very difficult for citizens and officials to apprehend the constitutional mandates and to find guidance and identifiable reasons for action. This obstructed the development and execution of constitutional mandates by the legislative and the executive, and it made it very difficult to build judicial interpretation. So it's kind of paradoxical, because at the same time that reform and constitutional reform enabled constitutional transition, it blocked constitutional and democratic consolidation. This was where we were in 2010. The country had gone almost 2 decades of democracy, and we had been able to construct an institutional framework that enabled checks and balances on power. And poverty had been declining, but on the other hand, there was an increasing discontent with corruption and inequality, and this led to a landslide election of current President López Obrador. For the first time in decades, the president had a majority in Congress and was the leader of a new party. President López Obrador has introduced a very polarizing narrative according to which his election inaugurated a new era in Mexico. This era's identity is constructed by anti-system narrative, by opposition of 4 decades of neoliberal rule that in his narrative is characterized by rampant corruption, moral decay, and the exploitation of the people. He says that there is a mafia and that this mafia in power is composed by the political, economic, and cultural elites that include the media and the academia need to be destroyed or displaced. And therefore, the institutional framework also needs to be discarded. So what has been happening, as Julio and Manuel will tell you, is that hyper-reformism has stopped, and the president is producing de facto constitutional changes through other means. And I will close with that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. And just for my students in the room, because there are some, did you note her conversation and discussion about the relationship between judicial interpretation and amendment, the frequency of amendment? We talked about that in class. Make sure I reiterate it. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Julio now. Thank you, Andrea. Wonderful.
Yes, I do. Well, meanwhile, I mean, we wait until Carl comes back and puts the presentation. So thank you very much, Stephanie. I'm very happy to be here. Thank Carl, Stephanie Esquivel, and all of you for being here tonight. Thanks to the Center for Constitutional Design at the Arizona State University. So I will focus my presentation on, and you will see why it was everything planned in advance, because given the framework that Andrea just gave regarding the dynamics of constitutional change in Mexico, I will focus on a particular series of reforms. Oh, thank you. On a particular series of reforms that were, out of those 700 plus reforms that we had in Mexico, there is a series of electoral reforms that are constitutional reforms, because many of the details of elections and parties are in the Mexican Constitution, that really transformed and were instrumental for Mexico's transition to democracy. So I will focus on that and the role of the court, on the Supreme Court, and then on the election of 2018, that it really is upsetting things in the country. So the first thing is how electoral reforms, I will show, promoted electoral competition, eventually helping or facilitating transition to democracy, and then how political competition actually empowered or activated the checks and balances that were in the Mexican Constitution since 1917. Then we'll look at the election of 2018. So first, this series of reforms, of electoral reforms, as Andrea was saying, we had more than 70 years of an authoritarian regime of the type of a hegemonic party. It was a peculiar authoritarian regime because there was elections. Every 6 years the president changed. There were legislative elections. Every 3 years the Chamber of Deputies changed. There was no re-election. So it was like a weird authoritarian system. The amendments of the Constitution that started in around the 1960s, 1970s were a means for accommodating the social demands that were mounting because of demographic change, also more social demands for inclusion and better representation. So as the country grew more complex, the party in power wisely, I think, started opening the door to welcome new political parties, new demands, and the way of opening the door was via the electoral reforms that made representation easier, for instance, proportional representation reforms, and also that made the counting of the votes and the organization of elections easier and more credible. That was, in essence, the idea. So here, the electoral reforms that started, like the first one, the big reform, the most important one, started in 1977, and these reforms, as I said, just until 2018, made improvements along those two dimensions: political representation or the organization of elections. Political representation, I mean, they facilitated the creation of parties and the support of political parties, and also facilitated access to elected branches of government. For instance, changing electoral formulas or increasing the district magnitude, all these things that matter for getting more of your deputies or your candidates into the legislative. And also, before an autonomous institution organ or electoral institution, was created, the counting and organizing of elections was in the hands of the government itself, much as in the US still. No? But in Mexico, the government was not credible because it was a hegemonic party. So one of the main demands of the opposition was to have an autonomous electoral institution that organized election and count the votes. So it was done that progressively via this series of reforms. So here you can see, let me see if I can point. Well, so here, what you have here is the number, these red lines means that in that year there was an electoral reform, like a constitutional reform on electoral issues. The height of the line means that the reform touched more dimensions. So it was like a broader reform, improving on both dimensions that I mentioned. And you see, it starts 1997, and then there are reforms almost every election. After the election, the losers essentially demanded more inclusion, better electoral institution, and there was another reform for the next election. Then the election takes place with some more parties in Congress, more demands, a new reform, and that was the dynamic. The blue line here is the effective number of parties in the House of Deputies. So as you can see, the electoral reforms really were effective, are correlated with an increasing number of parties in the legislative branch. No? By the year 2000, the long-governing party lost the presidential election for the first time in 71 years. So if we have to pinpoint a date for the transition to democracy in Mexico, it will be the year 2000, when the PRI lost the presidency for the first time. It was due to the electoral reform of 1996. This was a key electoral reform. It really made independent, and Manuel was part of that, like an active part of that change. It made the electoral institution autonomous, totally autonomous for the government. It created a really strong electoral, like civil service, like a professional civil service in the institution. It organized election with it was costly, but it was worth it. No? And we had the change in 2000. And then the number of parties continued growing. Now, what is interesting is in Mexico, the Constitution since 1917 was a federalist constitution. We had a Supreme Court. We had all sorts of checks and balances, all the right things in the Constitution, but the Constitution was, in a sense, dormant. There is a a writer in Mexico that says what happened in 2000 is that the Constitution woke up from its siesta, right? Why? Because electoral competition actually creates that some parties in Congress want a different thing from the executive, and then some states want a different thing from the federal government, and then whatever is in the Constitution starts having a more actual impact. No? Especially the Supreme Court, that is the one we will focus on. So here we have like two very important things for the Supreme Court to work. I think in Mexico and everywhere else, in fact. That is, on the one hand, whether the government is divided or unified, meaning is the same party in the executive, a majority party in both houses of Congress or not. No? So the red line is the percentage. Yeah, the red line is the percentage of seats that the governing party has in the lower chamber. That is like the indicator of divided or unified government. And this is the scale. Now, 100 is in the bottom, 0 is at the top. So in 1997, actually, after the reform of 1996, the PRI lost the majority in the Chamber of Deputies for the first time. Then in 2000 lost the presidency, but in 1997 lost the majority. And from then on until 2018, the governing party, no longer the PRI, but whoever was in the executive branch, didn't have the majority in Congress. That is really good news for the court, essentially because the activation of checks and balances. No? So the Supreme Court had, it was difficult for the executive and the legislative branch to coordinate against a decision made by the court that they didn't want or they didn't like. So that was very good news for the court. The bad news for the court in all this period is what this blue line represents. That is, this is the percentage of people that has some or much confidence in the judiciary. This is the question on the Latinobarometer. And here the scale is 0 in the bottom, 100 at the top. So as you can see, there is a long-standing deficit of legitimacy of the Supreme Court in Mexico. But divided government sort of compensated the deficit in legitimacy. Whenever the two things are low, like are together, unified government, legitimacy deficit, then the court is in trouble because the people doesn't like it, doesn't support the court. The public opinion is not really in favor of the court. And also the government can easily react against a decision that it doesn't like. But in this space, it was okay. In that time, the Supreme Court in Mexico did like a reasonable job, not the best court in the world, but a reasonable job. The court was empowered in 1994 with another constitutional reform. It was made independent. The court used its powers. The electoral tribunal also was made independent. We had judges like Manuel. So things worked. Of course, there are a lot of things, to fix in Mexico, no inequality. So there are a lot of demands in Mexico, legitimate demands for inclusion, inequality, political corruption, crime, and a long list. No, so it was not everything solved, but the checks and balances and the Constitution started working. In part because of the demands we had in 2018, the election of López Obrador. And then things start to get complicated because López Obrador and his newly created party won a majority, a supermajority actually, in the first 3 years of his government in the legislative power. So what happened in 2018 is this. The Supreme Court enters into a risk zone. It still has the legitimacy deficit, and now the government can react against it whenever It doesn't like something that the court does. Now, the Mexican Supreme Court has 11 justices. They are elected by the president with the consent of the Senate, no? Like in the US. A little difference with the US is the Mexican president proposes 3 candidates to the Senate, and the Senate picks 1, 2/3 majority. If the Senate rejects the set of 3 proposed by the president twice, the president chooses 1 from the second set of 3. So the president has the last word, and that is like a really not great design. They last for 15 years, which is okay, I think. Another weakening thing is that the court has to make decisions by supermajority rule. So 8 out of 11 justices have to agree in order to declare a law unconstitutional. So under President López Obrador, and Manuel will get into that, we have had a polarizing figure, like pushing the limits of his constitutional prerogatives, a lot of lawsuits against the government and against the laws that the government has passed, and they have reached the Supreme Court. The problem is the Supreme Court is in that uncomfortable position. Now, everything was okay until a new electoral law that was passed today, actually, today. This is a law, not a constitutional amendment, because the president couldn't get whatever Andrea told that is required for a constitutional amendment. It's a law that is clearly unconstitutional. It weakens the electoral institution. It gets rid of 80% of the civil servants in the electoral institution. It intrudes encroaches on the autonomy of the institution. It also helps the incumbents. I mean, it's a really regressive electoral reform in contrast to all other electoral reforms since 1977. It will be challenged, the law, before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will have to decide in the following months what happens. And Manuel will give the answer to that. Okay, so I will stop there. The thing is, now we don't know what will happen next. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good evening. Please don't wait my answers. I won't answer. But I'm going to talk about different things. This forum suggested me that there are other things more interesting, in fact, historical, about the constitutional development in Mexico. What a constitution means to Mexico. First, it began with Spain in the Cadiz Constitution, and then we developed a constitutionalism in our country even before the independence. So the idea of a constitution was very clear in the New Spain, Mexico, since 1812. Many of Mexicans contributed to the Convention of Cadiz to form that constitution. And second, the constitution was instrumental to make the independence of Mexico. It was not just an act of independence. The independence was achieved through a constitution, the 1814 Apatzingan. It's a strange name, but it's Apatzingan. It's a city in Mexico. So for me, the Apatzingan Constitution declared the independence of Mexico. It was the first one not to recognize the Spanish kings and to recognize popular sovereignty and to recognize distribution of powers, etc. And then a very important constitution came up in 1824 that ruled New Mexico, Texas, and California. And New Mexico split in Arizona. So the 1824 Constitution ruled all these beautiful and interesting countries that we lost, unfortunately. And I'm hosted in a hotel whose name is Polk. I thanks God that it's very short. And that 1824 Constitution gave us the Republican form of government, the representation of the people, and the federal system, and many other things. Now, the next step, of course, was a change of paradigm. And we switched from the American paradigm that we have adopted to the French paradigm, the centralization. And ever since 1836, we have collided the two paradigms in our country, and that's why we are so confused, probably. Mixed jurisdiction. In one part of our constitution is federalism, is judicial review, but in another part of our constitution is legislative nullification and all the centralist institutions that we still have. In 1847, thanks to the United States, we think about a new model of constitution, the 1847 Reformation Act, in which we adopted again the American model for the federal system and the institutions that we used to know back in 1824. But the 1847 Reformation Act is important because it gave us the protection of the Constitution. It was the first time that we saw the Constitution as a legal instrument, not only as a political document, but as a legal instrument. And we established in 1847 two institutions: the judicial review for the protection of human rights, and also the constitutional writ of constitutional to attack legal and even international treaties against the Constitution. As a matter of fact, through the recurso de reclamo, the writ of reclamo that was adopted in that year, we challenged the infamous Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that you may know. So that treaty was challenged before the Supreme Court, according to that time, for being unconstitutional. And it has to be unconstitutional at the time, but our president, whose name I don't remember because I don't want to, Santana, he took the money that the United States gave him. Now, in 1857, the next constitution, we established the federal system as a main institution in our country, and ever since, we haven't abandoned the federal system. We have been adapting the federal system, but we have been federal state since 1857. Now, the problem is that there's no more complex system of government than the federal system. And for instance, let me tell you why we have a constitution like that with so many reforms. Looking at the simplicity and rightness of the American Constitution, in which in 1819 you solved the problem of distribution of powers between the states and the federal government. In 1932, we have a case to the Supreme Court regarding the Monte Alban ruins. I don't know if you know the Monte Alban ruins in the state of Oaxaca. It's a beautiful place, and Oaxaca began to regulate the archaeological monuments in the state, but the federal government rejected the idea that the state could regulate that. And then there was a controversy before the Supreme Court, that is the controversy in constitutional terms, 2-1932, that is about the Monte Alban. The controversy was whether Mexico had implied powers to legislate or explicit powers to regulate. And because we got confused, we got the two of them, implied powers and explicit powers. So how is that possible? We have, in McCulloch versus Maryland, you said that you had the clause about implied powers, right? And you abandoned the explicitness of the federal government. But we also have the explicitness for the federal government. So back in 1932, it was clear for us that we are not a federal system. We are not a unitary system, according to the French paradigm, but what we are is a confederation. The confederation, right? So how can we combine these things? Okay, and this system is still in force. It's up to the Supreme Court to decide whether it should be or not. In the case of Monte Albán, for instance, Oaxaca government challenged that the federal government wanted to regulate the archaeological ruins without having an explicit power in the Constitution for that. And you know, because of McCulloch, that you don't need an explicit power for the federal government to regulate these kind of things. But Oaxaca insisted, show me where is your explicit power to regulate these archaeological sites. And there was none. Unfortunately, the Attorney General knew a lot about American law. And he said, remember that we have a paradigm in the United States, McCulloch versus Maryland, and you don't need to have an explicit power to regulate as a federal government. You are going to look for the general welfare of the country. And that precedent took place in 1932. So we have the uncomfortable association of this paradox. Now, in 1917, as Julio mentioned, we also have another important and interesting thing. Froilán Manjarrés, who was a deputy, a representative from the state of Puebla, mentioned that in the constitution that they were debating at the time, that is our current constitution, they have to include all the rights for the workers and all the rights for the land reform. These topics were very important at the time because the Mexican Revolution was exactly fought by these workers and land reform, the peasants. And of course, all the lawyers at the convention, bloody lawyers, said, no, that's not for the Constitution to include. And Manjarrés said, I don't care. He was, as a matter of fact, a journalist. He said, I don't care. We need to establish in the Constitution these specific human rights for workers and land workers as well. And that was a very important pronunciation. The Constitution is not only a frame of government. It has to include everything that I don't see quite well. Carol is saying, waving at me.
5 minutes? Is 5 minutes okay?
Sure. And that is the problem. So since 1917, we include everything that is important in the country and the social environment in the Constitution. The last thing to consider is that Mexico turned to the international law as a source of constitutional issue. And because of the international law established condemned the Mexican situation in electoral system by the Human Rights Commission of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, we included the due process of law in elections. Before 1990, elections were away from the protection of human rights. As a matter of fact, there's some precedents in the Supreme Court saying that political rights are not human rights. Imagine that. So what they are. They belong to the political process and they are not to be protected by the Supreme Court. But in 1990, because of that advisory, the Commission included Mexico, the due process in elections, in the Constitution. And this is why it's so outrageous, the Plan B, the so-called Plan B of the current president. He wants to take out from the Constitution the electoral process that is present in all the constitutions in the past, from 1812. The Cadiz Constitution had a chapter on the elections. It was a big, important issue. And said, no, elections shouldn't be regulated by the Constitution, but it should be enacted by regular law, ordinary law. And this is a new trend, proper for someone who doesn't know law. The trend that the constitutional reform is through legislation. Imagine that. Of course, if you control Congress, if you control the legislative process, you can make your country as yourself. Fortunately, we have a new Supreme Court and a Chief Justice she's a lady, very knowledgeable in constitutional law, and I strongly think that they won't authorize this proposition that is completely unconstitutional, as Julio has mentioned. Thank you.
Well, Julio, thank you so much. I haven't covered McCulloch versus Maryland in my constitutional law class yet, but I will be soon. So I think next week is better. So thank you for mentioning that. And the important notion of constitutional amendment by regular legislation is very worrisome. And we're seeing in Israel today, that is the issue in Israel. So I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Andrea, as well. And I turn it over to the audience for questions about the Mexican system, constitutional design, constitutional change, and do we have there's a microphone. So please come and ask your questions of our distinguished panelists. If you have some, and if you don't, then I'll continue to ask questions.
Yeah, I'll get it started. We were sort of taking a pause here. I was very interested in some of the issues that you discussed. I'm Latin American, and I've got to publicly confess I'm a dropout of law school. And I was trying to figure out, I'm not as familiar, I've been to Mexico many times and to universities, but I'm not as familiar with the legal systems in Mexico. And I wanted to find out what the blending of Roman law with Napoleonic law, with, so far from God, so close to the United States, with US law had been. And I think to a large extent, you clarified that with your historical summary. Now, are we to say, I sound very loud with a loudspeaker, but are we to say that the 1817 Constitution was the first Mexican Constitution, or do you go back to pre-Napoleonic days? I don't know. Can you help us with that?
Sure. Thank you, ma'am, and thank you for being here. It's the 1812 Cadiz Constitution.
Right.
And it's because Napoleon. The Spanish don't accept that. But that constitution was forced by Napoleon. He invaded Spain, and then the Spanish people organized themselves and enacted a constitution. That constitution attracted all the Spanish Americans, as we call Americans, because the name of Americans belong to us. and the Spanish peninsulars. So that was the first one, and it had force in Mexico. But of course, as soon as the kings of Spain returned, they abolished that, but they were forced to reestablish that. That's the first thing. The second thing that you mentioned was regarding
The combination of Napoleonic and Roman
Oh, okay.
common law.
Very interesting question. In the sense that we are a civil law country, as you know, and a civil law we follow the codification made in France, and we try to detail the laws according if they were a code. That's why our constitution is not a constitution, but it's a political code. So we want to amend and introduce everything. It's not necessary. This is something that we are thinking. It's not necessary to have a complete constitution of 136 articles. That's too much. Let's try to apart the meaning of the constitution to the Supreme Court. Why not? We don't have, for instance, the wonderful cases like in the United States, not only McCulloch, but also all the cases regarding the indigenous rights, 1832, 1831, and I have some cases over here. Marbury versus Madison, the judicial review. We couldn't. One of the surprising things is that you have you are the country for judicial review. Well, Great Britain was first, but then after that, you were the country who created the judicial review. But I don't find judicial review in your constitution. I don't find the foundations in Article 3 of your constitution for judicial. That would be impossible for Mexico. We have to reform our constitution back in 1847 to include judicial review and to include all the remedies for constitutional redress. So, for instance, last one, Griswold versus Connecticut. That wonderful case. The Penumbra of Human Rights, Amendment 9, which is a wonderful case for that. We couldn't do that. We need to have specified at least the principle of that human right in the Constitution. So.
What about, sorry to follow up, but what about the tension? Is there a tension in Mexico, I don't know, between the codes and the letter of the Constitution? Any code, civil code, commercial code, I don't know how many codes you have. Is there a tension? Is there?
This is something that Andrea.
So yeah, no. What I was exactly pointing out is that so the problem that Manuel was saying is that we have a very complex constitution that has been amended many times, and then you have a very complex system with certain inconsistencies. And also you have some codes that if you are changing the constitution, some codes are not changing at the same time. So that creates complexities that, because you have a lot of changing, a very high rate of constitution. But of course, then is when the Supreme Court enters, and the Supreme Court has been, and that's what the graph I was showing you, the court has played a very important role to make functional hyper-reformism, a constitution that is under hyper-reformism. Why? Because a lot of conflicts that arrive to the court because of the inconsistencies of the court, of the constitution with other laws and within the proper constitution needs to be solved. So that's the reason why hyper-reformism has also increased the interpretation of the Constitution and the role of the court as a transform, like someone that establishes the meaning of the Constitution. So I think that's the interesting part, that you have a complementary relationship between reform and interpretation.
I'm gonna, while we wait for perhaps more questions from our audience, I wanna ask Julio a question, something that jumped out at me from your graph. I love the risk areas that you identified when the situation appears that the court will be challenged by a more unified legislature that can overcome the supermajority requirements, et cetera. I thought that was very interesting. But I note that the court's legitimacy has stagnated. Now, in terms of public opinion. Now, in the U.S., the Supreme Court's legitimacy or its public approval rating by the obviously by the public has ebbed and flowed, and is ebbing at the moment, actually. But why has it remained so static? Has the Supreme Court not attempted to? I mean, is there something the Supreme Court could have done to increase its legitimacy? The U.S. Supreme Court has been very careful to husband its authority and protect its legitimacy. You know, recently there's been challenges, but what's going on with the Supreme Court of Mexico?
Thank you. So the data that I show comes from the Latinobarometer, and the good thing about that data is that it covers a lot of years, like from the 1990 something up to today. In other polls, you can see more changes in public opinion, but the fact, you are right, is that the Mexican court has not really break through the 50% limit of public approval of its work. That is, I think, in Latin America, it's the rule. Not very large numbers support the courts, constitutional or supreme. The exceptions in Latin America are the Constitutional Court of Colombia, the Constitutional Court, or the Sala Cuarta, like the Constitutional Chamber of Costa Rica, and to a lesser extent, the Supreme Court of Brazil, the Constitutional Tribunal of Brazil, the Supremo Tribunal Federal. Why? I think that those three courts are also the ones that have pushed more strongly for social and economic rights. So the courts in Latin America that have worked more towards progressive, for instance, health, to uphold the health rights, the right to health, also a right to housing, also like the social and economic rights in general are the courts that became more popular and more supported. The Mexican Supreme Court in that regard has been very conservative. It has done like a lot of good decisions, but the effects of the decisions of the Mexican Supreme Court are restricted to the parties that present the case. The effects are not generalizable to everybody. So you may win a case, for instance, regarding your right to a certain medicine, but that doesn't go to everybody. It just, I mean, it's effective for you. The Constitutional Court in Colombia and Costa Rica, they actually gave general effects to their decision in social rights. That created other troubles, like, for instance, budgetary troubles. But in terms of public support, they did better. So I think that's the main issue why the Mexican Supreme Court's approval rate has stagnated in that level.
Something that I think is very important regarding what Julio just said is that, so when you saw the graphs of, and we were, the three of us, talking about how the Constitution, the role the Constitution played in transition to democracy, as Manuel was saying, for instance, federalism became very complex once we had a democracy. So the court was mainly focused on establishing the functions of the states vis-a-vis the federal government, and we have 3 levels of federalism, so it's extremely complex, and delimiting the faculties. And they did for several decades very little regarding rights. That has changed lately, but it probably would have been much better if the court would have been more engaged with rights and less so with checks and balances, or at least we have done more on that.
So the court should have been more populist.
Yeah, I think so.
That's pretty
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Questions out there? Yes, sir. And we have the
So you talked about the federalist system of Mexico, and then it came up again in the last question. What are some of the differences or similarities between federalism in the United States Constitution and federalism or confederatism, either way, in the Mexican Constitution?
Would you be so kind to invite me for a course on that? Well, it's immense. It's immense. First of all, the distribution of powers between the federal and the state. Second, the obedience of the governors towards the central through the budget. The budget has been centralized, and the federal government gives or take the money. Third, states only copy the institutions on the federal level. Back in the original system in Mexico, we had states with creation of institutions. For instance, we have states making the executive to be collective. The original founder of the Amparo suit was from Yucatan, and he drafted the Constitution of Yucatan, putting 2 people or 3 people in the executive, something that you discussed in the Founding Fathers, but you rejected. But we still have doubts about that, because they saw the future of a potential dictatorship, and they were right. If we follow, for instance, the Uruguay example, are you from there?
No, I'm not from Uruguay. I'm actually from Argentina.
Wonderful.
But I would say the
Well,
same culture.
Argentina is the section of, Uruguay is a section. Not anymore. República Oriental. But that's true. So, for instance, we have 2 states that have a judiciary in the hands of 1 person, Minister of Justice, but it was a judge. So they have a lot of creativity, the states, and they work for many things. We don't have senates in the states like you have, but we began with 7 states adopting the Senate. So there are a lot of characteristics of our system. Very interesting question. Thank you.
I have another question, but I don't want to take so much time.
Question?
What happened?
Wait, one second. We have a student who wants to ask a question. I want to make sure.
Hi. So I studied international law and human rights before I came here. So I kind of had a question about the human rights aspect of the Constitution. And if you could talk more a little bit about this disparity you seem to have with it needing to be explicitly listed in the Constitution that something is a right, but on the other hand, like not being able to recognize that right until then. I just found that interesting from the U.S. perspective because we don't really have that many rights listed in our Constitution, but our court does often kind of infer rights from what we have. So yeah, that.
I think it's your.
Make sure this is on. There we go.
What should I say? But it's true. It's true. Mexico's salvation is in the international law. To say it, we consider that because human declarations of international law are adopted in Mexico. Even they don't have the force of international treaties, but they are not. But we are considering that general principles of international law, jus cogens, is in the same binding effect for the country. And talking about courts, as Julio mentioned, the electoral court in Mexico at first realized that it was not a legitimate court, another court, right? And we took the decision to go abroad. And that's why we have a representative before the Council of Europe, Venice Commission. We are a member of the Venice Commission since 2010. And we discuss and debate human rights issues of all over the world that they congregated in the Venice Commission. And that gives us a lot of strength, recognition as a domestic court with international level. For instance, the so-called Plan B of this president has been condemned by the Venice Commission. The Venice Commission says that it's not in the judicial standards, international standards, to organize popular elections for magistrates of the courts. For God's sake, I don't know if in Arizona you elect justices.
It's retention elections here, but there are 38 states that do elect their
I
judges.
know, and I should thank, with all respect, to Sandra Day O'Connor because they are against. She is against this election. So we didn't have any experience in electing judges. Well, in the past, in the 19th century, but there were no political parties at the time. Once that you organize an election for judges, you throw the judges, the justice system, in the political parties. And I don't know if that's good.
Can I just to complement the answer? So one of the most important reforms we had on human rights is the inclusion of all rights that are. Mexico has signed a lot of international treaties, and that they have a constitutional standing. So every single international treaty has constitutional, and so we have a lot of rights. I mean, and what is interesting and is part of what Manuel was telling you, the 1917 Constitution was the first in the world to recognize social and economic rights. And so the inclusion of rights is, I would say, it's really, really large. And the court has also made very important interpretations of rights. So I do think that that recognition of rights is really, really large in Mexico in that sense.
Yes, I just wanted to clarify because we have been talking about Plan B and the reform. That may be a little confusing. So the thing is, the current president submitted a constitutional amendment that implied a change of the electoral system. That is the Plan A. The Plan A including electing the members of the electoral institution and the members of the electoral tribunal, like by open election. So that was, no. But that constitutional reform did not pass. So it didn't gather the 2/3 majority required for a constitutional amendment. Then the president submitted what is known as the Plan B. That is like a comprehensive electoral reform that does not include those things, but does undermine the autonomy of the electoral institution, get rid of 80% of the civil service in the institution. And so that is a law, that is like a regular law, and that is the law that will be challenged and that the Constitution will decide upon in the following months. Just that clarification.
Do you have another question?
Well, it might be very specific, but I've been very intrigued by the ejidos. And then I don't know if my Mexican history is very bad. I must be excused. But I don't know if it was Porfirio Diaz time on the division of the land. Where does that fit constitutionally, and does it have any enforceable powers? Anybody?
Oh, the history.
You're the expert on history.
Yes, the ejido is a very antique institution from the Spanish regime.
I've been in one.
What is it?
Really?
What is it?
Land
Land ownership.
Yes, and it was established in Article 27. It was one of the articles that Manjarres thought that it should be there. And Article 27 is detailing the characteristics of the ejido. It was changed completely in 1992 by another president, Salinas de Gortari. The ejido didn't allow the selling of the land in order to protect the workers. But Salinas de Gortari said, no, let's sell it. And some of the communities have sold the land for that purpose. I don't know very much about that, unfortunately, but it's an institution that I would say in decay because it's not very well preserved. And there are even agrarian tribunals to protect, but they are under the submission of the executive. And I don't know how impartial they are, unfortunately. I'm sorry to give you this answer.
So there are no provisions in the Constitution that have anything to do with the ejido.
Yes, in Article 27.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe, we're just about out of time, I think. I thought maybe it'd be worthwhile just perhaps touching base with each of the panelists on a, I think, an important question and a predictive one. What we've been focusing on here is the threat to democracy that may come if Plan B is enacted, because it will gut the electoral institutions that have sustained Mexican democracy since 1997, I think you said, Julio, or thereabouts, or Andrea. So it is going to end up in the Supreme Court, requiring an 8-vote supermajority to overturn it, which means that there's probably 1 or 2 justices who will determine the outcome. Is that what you're thinking? So if we could start and move our way down here, and then perhaps you might say a word about the consequences if the court does not overturn the law for Mexican democracy. And will we see another PRI type situation with Morena in power for 70 years? And so I thought perhaps we might take it from there.
Yes. No. So well, first, I mean, it has to be said that the current government is absolutely legitimate. It won the election in 2018, by a huge majority, 50-something%. It won a majority in both houses of Congress. I mean, it was like a really, I mean, it's a legitimately, democratically elected government. That's why it's in part hard to come to terms with the fact that they are actually undermining the core institution that made this government and the previous democratically elected governments possible. No? So as you say, the law will be challenged. Manel was saying that the lawyers have already prepared the lawsuit, so as soon as the president signs the law, I think tomorrow or the day after, the lawsuits will be filed before the Supreme Court. In order to declare the law unconstitutional, you need 8 out of 11 votes. out of the 11 justices, I would say 3 are really in favor, really closely aligned to the executive. The former Chief Justice and 2 justices that were elected during this administration, appointed during this administration. So really it comes down to one more vote. If there is one more justice that votes not to declare the law unconstitutional, then the law will stand, even though there are 7 justices who believe and argue that the law is unconstitutional. That happened with the law of energy policy. It created a lot of trouble with the U.S. I don't know what will happen. I want to believe, but it's like really like a desire from a citizen's point of view, that I think that, as Manuel said, the new Chief Justice is going to try to argue and convince her fellow justices to at least, declare the most undermining parts of the law unconstitutional. If not, I think then we enter into uncharted territory. I don't know what will happen. In part because, contrary to what happened to this president, the legitimacy of it will be really chaotic. The general election next year. Well, it's a country of 130 million people, 80 million voters. The election will be huge. It's not only the presidency, also both houses of the legislative, many state governments. So it will be a huge election next year. Without the institution that has the capacity to set the polling booths. I mean, it's close to 1,000 polling booths across the country, 100,000, sorry. Our system is really complex because we draw citizens randomly to serve at the polling booths. And that has to be organized. I mean, it takes a lot of effort to organize every federal election in Mexico. So that one, without 80% of the people in the institution, that will be really hard to do. So there will be a lot of challenges to whatever the result it is. So the worst scenario is the legitimacy of the winning candidate will not come from the votes, but from, I think, the current president, who will, raise the arm of whoever he supports and say, or she, and said, the people spoke and she's the president, or he is the president, but he has a she candidate, like a preferred candidate. So that is, but how will the opposition react? The citizens, I don't know. There is violence. I mean, violence will likely be more acute. I don't know. I mean, I hope it doesn't go through, but yeah.
Right.
Manuel, something to add?
Yes, that's very interesting. First, the opposition wouldn't allow that, I hope. The opposition will challenge to the last resort, even beyond the Supreme Court. Beyond the Supreme Court, there's another court, the electoral court. And it could be challenged in different ways to the electoral court. And in the electoral court, there's a lot of results possible for that. If not, the worst case scenario is to suggest that Mexico become a parliamentary system. A parliamentary system because in that way, the president can't really change the constitution through legislation. And if he wants to do that, he has to be a member of the parliament. Not this president, the future presidents. And that would be the decline of the presidential system in Mexico. We depart from the United States, and we probably will go to the parliamentary system. There have been at least 3 projects to adopt the parliamentary system in Mexico. And they have been rejected. But as a matter of fact, this president conducts or behaves that way. Let's put it in the parliament. And if the president is part of the parliament, then that would be another form of government. But I don't think that that's bad. I think that we change 200 years of presidential system. It's good for a trial. We couldn't be the United States. We couldn't follow the presidential system in the United States. Let's go to Britain and have a parliamentary system then.
Well, I would only add that, so what I think will happen is that, so if Plan B goes on, as Julio says, I think we would have very much a democratic backsliding, and then probably we will have increased violence, increased instability, and I don't know, then the coin will be in the air. It will be really sad because we would have had, and I think now we can close with that and give you with that sense, we would have the whole arc. We would have a constitution that was able to produce a very slow transition to democracy through reforms, little by little. Then we would have attained democracy in 2000, and we would then had a backsliding with a government that would have created transformation de facto of the constitution through legislation. And then, well, that would be really sad because then our constitution would have been able to create democracy but not to consolidate it. And maybe that also might leave us with a reflection of what can be done through constitutional change and what is required to consolidate democracy. That I would close with that.
That is a great point. What do we need? Is this one? What do we need to consolidate democracy? And that is the perennial question, isn't it? Consolidate and perpetuate. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here, listening to this fascinating conversation about Mexico. Thank you for educating us. I think we'll all walk away much more aware of the current situation in Mexico, how it could ultimately change for the worse in terms of democratic backsliding, and how we need to pay attention. So to learn, to appreciate and understand constitutional change. So thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate your insights, knowledge. Thanks to our audience.
majority required in a constitutional amendment. Then the president submitted what is known as the Plan B. That is like a really like a comprehensive electoral reform that does not include those things, but does undermine the autonomy of the electoral institution, get rid of 80% of the civil service, the institution. And so that is a law, that is like a regular law, and that is the law that will be challenged and that the Constitution will decide upon in the following years. Just to put that down.
Well, it might be very specific, but I've been very intrigued by the Hebrews. And then, I don't know if my Mexican history is very bad, I must be excused, but I don't know if it was considered the U.S. time or the beginning of the Enacted. When was that constitutional, and does it have any enforceable powers? Anybody?
Yes, the Ejido is a very antique institution from the Spanish regime.
I believe one.
Really?
Yeah, in Tamaulipas.
Yes. And it was established in Article 27. It was one of the articles that Majarres thought that it should be there. Article 27 is detailing the characteristics of the Ejido. It was changed completely in 1992 by another president, Salinas de Gortari. The Ejido didn't allow the selling of the land in order to protect the workers. But Salinas de Gortari said, no, let's sell it. And some of the communities have sold the land for that purpose. I don't know very much about that, unfortunately, but it's an institution that I would say is decayed because it's not very well preserved. There are even agrarian tribunals to protect, but they are under the submission of executive, and I don't know how impartial they are, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
So there are no provisions in the Constitution that have anything to do with it.
Yes, in Article 27.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe, we're just about out of time, I think. I thought maybe it'd be worthwhile just perhaps touching base with each of the panelists on I think, an important question and a predictive one. What we've been focusing on here is the threat to democracy that may come if Plan B is enacted because it will gut the electoral institutions that have sustained Mexican democracy since 1997, I think you said, Julio, or thereabouts, or Andrea. So it is going to end up in the Supreme Court, requiring an 8-vote supermajority to overturn it, which means that there's probably 1 or 2 justices who will determine the outcome. Is that what you're thinking? So if we could start and move our way down here, and then perhaps you might say a word about the consequences if the court does not overturn the law for Mexican democracy. And will we see another PRI type situation with Morena in power for 70 years? And so I thought perhaps we might take it from there.
Yes, no. So well, first, I mean, it has to be said that the current government is absolutely legitimate. It won the election in 2018, like by a huge majority, 50-something%. Won a majority in both houses of Congress. I mean, it was like a really, I mean, it's a legitimately, democratically elected government. That's why it's in part hard to come to terms with the fact that they are actually undermining the core institution that made his government and the previous democratically elected governments possible. No? So as you say, the law will be challenged. Manuel was saying that the lawyers have already prepared the lawsuit. So as soon as the president signs the law, I think tomorrow or the day after, the lawsuits will be filed before the Supreme Court. They need, so in order to declare the law unconstitutional, you need 8 out of 11 votes. Out of the 11 justices, I would say 3 are really in favor, really closely aligned to the executive. The former Chief Justice and 2 justices that were elected during this administration, appointed during this administration. So really it comes down to one more vote. If there is one more justice that votes not to declare the law unconstitutional, then the law will stand, even though there are 7 justices who believe and argue that the law is unconstitutional. That happened with the law of energy policy. You know, that is, it created a lot of trouble with the U.S. I don't know what will happen. I want to believe, but it's like really like a desire from a citizen's point of view, that I think that, as Manuel said, the new Chief Justice is going to try to argue and convince her fellow justices to at least, you know, declare the most undermining parts of the law and constitution. If not, I think then we enter into uncharted territory. I don't know what will happen. In part because, contrary to what happened to this president, the legitimacy of it will be really chaotic. The general election next year. Well, it's a country of 130 million people, 18 million voters. The election will be huge. It's not only the presidency, also both houses of the legislature, many state governments. So it will be a huge election next year. Without the institution that has the capacity to set the polling booths, I mean, it's close to 1,000 polling booths across the country, 100,000, sorry. Our system is really complex because we draw citizens randomly to serve at the polling booths. And that has to be organized. I mean, it takes a lot of effort to organize every federal election institution. That would, without 80% of the people in the institution, that would be really hard to do. So there will be a lot of challenges to whatever the result it is. So the worst scenario is the legitimacy of the winning candidate will not come from the votes, but from, I think, the current president who will, you know, raise the arm of whoever he supports and say, or she, I said, the people spoke and she's the president, or he is the president. He has a she prefer to do. So that is, but how will the opposition react? The citizens, I don't know. There is violence. I mean, violence will likely be more acute. I don't know. I mean, I hope it doesn't.
Yes, that's very interesting. First, the position wouldn't allow that, I hope. The position would challenge the last resort, even beyond the Supreme Court. Beyond the Supreme Court, there's another court, the electoral court. And it could be challenged in different ways in the electoral court. And in the electoral court, there's a lot of results possible for that. If not, the worst case scenario is to suggest that Mexico become a parliamentary system. A parliamentary system because in that way, the president can really change the constitution through legislation. And if he wants to do that, he has to be a member of the parliament. Not this president, the future president. And that would be the decline of the presidential be a part of the United States, and probably you go to the parliamentary system. There have been at least 3 projects to adopt a parliamentary system in Mexico, and they have been rejected. But as a matter of fact, this president conducts and behaves that way. Let's put it in the parliament. And if the president is part of the parliament, then that would be another form of government. But I don't think that that's bad. I don't think that will change. 200 years of presidential system is good for a tribe. We couldn't be in the United States. We couldn't follow the presidential system in the United States. Let's go to Britain and have a parliamentary system.
I would only add that so what I think will happen is that so if Plan B goes on as Julio says, I think we would have very much a democratic backsliding, and then probably we will have increased violence, increasing instability, and I don't know, then the coin will be in the air. It will be really sad because we would have had, and I think now we can close with that and give you with that sense, we would have the whole arc. We would have a constitution that was able to produce a very slow transition to democracy through reforms, little by little. Then we would have attained democracy in 2000, and we would then had a backsliding with a government that would have created transformation de facto of the constitution through legislation. And then, well, that would be really sad because then our constitution would have been able to create democracy but not to consolidate it. And maybe that also might leave us with a reflection of what can be done through constitutional change and what is required to consolidate democracy. And I will close with that.
That is a great point. What do we need? What do we need to consolidate democracy? And that is the perennial question, isn't it? Consolidate and perpetuate. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here, listening to this fascinating conversation about Mexico. Thank you for educating us. I think we'll all walk away much more aware of the current situation in Mexico, how it could ultimately change for the worse in terms of democratic backsliding, and how we need to pay attention. So to learn, to appreciate and understand constitutional change. So thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate your insights, knowledge, and everything. Plenty more wine, so do help yourselves, for goodness sake. And food, too. And thank you to Carol, and thank you to Stephanie, as always.